Today we'll be talking about the Africa Economic Outlook, and we are hosting Jared Osoro, a very seasoned economist with Kenya Bankers Association, who is based in Kenya. My name is Pius Mushiro Mugo, the Managing Director of Nabu Capital, and you're watching Invest in Africa. Jared, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you and to talk about Africa, our mother continent.
Pleasure all mine. I'm usually biased in favor of Africa.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure we'll have a fantastic conversation. But just speaking from an investor's point of view, the last 5 years have been extremely difficult up to December 2018. I'd say, I think in my entire investment career, the last 5 years have been the most difficult. I think 3 out of those 5 years were bearish years, and one was a muted year, and only 2017 was a bullish year. So investors who are investing in Africa, especially on the Africa MSCI index, ex-South Africa, I was just looking at the numbers, they would have made a negative return of 19%. And over a 5-year period. During that time also, we've had some unprecedented events, like the oil plunging below 50. We've also had very volatile and unfavorable commodity prices. We've also seen very marked currency devaluations. Nigeria, Egypt, Angola, Ethiopia, among others. We've also seen some countries like Egypt and Ghana requiring IMF interventions, and thankfully they've been successful interventions. We also saw some things that we had not expected, like the abrupt exit of Mugabe and Zuma before their time. And in the coming year, 2019, actually in this year of 2019, we are expecting 11 major elections across the continent. Just to mention a few: Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Tunisia, among others. But also I was just looking at some of the data and I saw a report by the CBA bank that was saying that the Sub-Saharan Africa growth is projected to accelerate to 3.5 in 2018. And it just lays the ground for 2019. I just wanted to hear your views. In terms of 2019, what are the opportunities and challenges that you foresee in Africa in 2019?
You know, Africa is a very interesting continent in two respects. It's one that is often misunderstood, especially when you look at it from afar.
Yes.
There are people who think that Africa is a country. And that's why you hear speak like China and Africa. Without recognizing that, Africa is comprised of over 50 countries, yes. Albeit with a number of them having similar characteristics. The principal one being that many of them what you can call small open economies, meaning that in the individual level they are price takers for what they import and what they export. Of course, that's speaking to the vulnerabilities that they have. The story of Africa over the last 5 years, as slightly before we started seeing the sharp downturn in terms of growth, was characterized by strong growth, in the sense that the period subsequent to the global financial crisis, Sub-Saharan Africa's average growth was well above the global growth. And then the story turned with the oil prices dropping drastically. At a time when the South African economy, that's not an oil exporter, actually experiencing serious economic challenges and going into a recession. So that tells you one level of vulnerability of the African economy, where the two dominant economies, that's Nigeria, which is the biggest in terms of nominal GDP, and South Africa, which is the second, but the most sophisticated in terms of structure and all, also experiencing challenges. Now, there's an exercise that is usually undertaken by the African Development Bank, where they rank the top 10 African economies. If you watch that, you'll see that the ranking, the countries may be the same, but the ranking shifts depending on two things: whether it rains or whether the oil prices are in a certain direction. That is something that has basically drawn the attention of any analyst in the continent as to, is the continent diversified enough to allow it sustain a growth momentum. It's actually worrying when you see the sub-Saharan Africa growth being lower than the global average. That tells you that there's quite a bit of weaknesses in the continent. That does not speak of the good spots insofar as the continent is concerned. The one thing that will make us happy, and maybe it's a bias because we're Kenyans, is that over the period in which the African sub-Saharan African growth has been slow, the average growth for Kenya has been fairly good. Actually, over the last 10 years, it's been about 5.1% in real terms. That speaks to the extent to which the economy is diversified, unlike some that depend on resources. And that also speaks to an element of resilience, because it doesn't mean that over that period we haven't had any shocks. We've had a number of shocks that manifest themselves in probably the prices of food and stuff like that. So if you were to look at it in totality, a number of countries, some of which you mentioned, have gone through severe challenges in their balance of payment that has necessitated them to seek support of institutions such as IMF. In our case, I think the IMF support was basically what you can call a standby facility. It was not clearly, an indication of a weak external position. So if one was to look at Africa, insofar as investment is concerned, usually the markets tend to reflect what's happening in the general economy. So it's not a wonder that from where you see as somebody who's investing or advising investments, you've seen some challenges in the recent past. And those challenges are really attributable to the vulnerabilities that I pointed out regarding dependence on commodity, particularly fossil, the oil, and lack of diversification. But if the outlook that I've seen from, for instance, the African Development Bank in what they call the African Economic Outlook is to be relied upon, then I think we are turning the cycle. And that is positive. But the extent of being positive should not be taken with a sense of caution. Let's not wrap ourselves with the flag of Africa rising without recognizing that as Africa develops, its extent of integration with the rest of the world is also developing. So the African outlook must be seen in the context of the globe. So there is a sense of optimism on Africa, because, as I said, there are some what you can call countries that are doing fairly okay. Those that have not been doing well on account of the oil prices probably will start seeing a sense of recovery, because we saw the oil prices moving up. We don't know how long that will be sustained in view of the geopolitical development that are happening on the world. But in totality, we probably see a better year, a better 2019 for Africa than the previous year.
Okay. That's interesting. So if you were to choose 5 countries that you'd consider to be the top 5 investment destinations in Africa, which countries would that be?
You see, it's not an easy pick, because there are no 2 countries that are homogeneous from an endowment standpoint, from a policy standpoint, and even from an institutional standpoint. Without naming countries, if I were to pick a country where I will invest in, I look at a country where there is what you can call requisite infrastructure that supports the capacity of the economy. And infrastructure is not necessarily physical infrastructure. Infrastructure in totality, the policy environment, the physical infrastructure itself, what you can call the extent to which the policy environment supports productivity. And a good indicator is the parameter as given by the ease of doing business. The countries that have been doing pretty well in terms of the ease of doing business probably will be the ones that investors are looking at. And we know countries such as Rwanda have been doing pretty well in terms of the ease of doing business. I think we've seen Kenya doing a lot of improvement insofar as the ease of doing business is concerned. Countries such as Ethiopia have seen fundamental changes in terms of their growth profile. So much so that, you know, it's an economy that is more than doubled from where it was a decade down the road. So that simply tells you that those looking for opportunity will look at the growth spots. And not just growth, but growth as supported by capacity, by infrastructure, and an extent of diversity. Because if you're growing fast and you're not diversified, that speaks to how vulnerable you are. So without necessarily ranking, I think you can see the areas where I'm pointing out. The Eastern African economy has actually been doing pretty well. And if you look at the African growth outlook, as we're talking about, the Eastern African bloc has actually been one of the leaders insofar as propelling that growth is concerned. So there's quite a bit of opportunity in the Eastern Africa. The other economies, particularly the Western Africa and the Central Africa, they are both geopolitical challenges as well as vulnerabilities arising from either dependence on commodity that has tended to strain their fiscal positions and therefore their ability to register strong growth. So again, as I said earlier, it depends on the type of investor we're talking about here. There are those investors who are looking at markets, and those who are looking at markets will look at parameters such as to what extent is an economy open to investors. The biggest critique that I've seen from commentary on the Ethiopian economy is that yes, it's growing fast, but the extent to which its policy space can allow for investors is a bit constraining. But we've seen quite substantial changes in the recent past from a policy standpoint. So that makes it a very strong candidate for investments. And of course, you know, the thing is, if you're investing in Eastern Africa, if that is the preferred destination, you're looking at Eastern Africa as a block, and you're looking at it more or less as one market. And if you look at the extent to which we integrated, both from the context of trade and from the context of investment, then investing in one country does not make sense if you're not looking at the neighboring countries as a market. So that is why I'll rather look at it from a regional perspective.
As a block.
As opposed to looking at individual countries. Given what I said earlier, that many of these countries are what you can call small open economies.
No, it's interesting you say that, because I think since I began my career in investment, the last couple of years, the first time that I've really seen East Africa economy being seen at the top, with Nigeria and South Africa losing their number one and number two spot. And you know, you already mentioned this, the Africa Rising. I don't know, that is a cliche.
It's a cliche, it's a mantra.
But is it real, or is it? And if at all, if it's there, what would be a catalyst for a rising Africa? And I know here we're talking about many countries. You see, the shift of narrative to Africa Rising is fundamental. I don't know whether you recall that in the year 2000, I can even try to recall the date. The Economist had on this cover page the map of Africa with a huge caption of the hopeless continent. So moving from being characterized as a hopeless continent, characterized by war and all the evil things that we think about, to it being seen as a rising continent is a fundamental shift. And that shift actually is not baseless. I mean, there are so many things that are going for Africa in terms of the potential that it has. And the one thing that I think is changing is Africa not simply being seen as a market. You produce elsewhere and you come and sell in Africa. And that realization has come as a result of the fact that if you produce elsewhere and you don't invest in Africa, then the capacity of Africa to afford what you're producing elsewhere is constrained. So that therefore tells you that the narrative of African Rising is actually real.
But that means that for us to realize it, we have to put a number of things in order. I think the period before the global financial crisis, a number of African economies had gone through debt challenges, and they had to be forgiven under initiatives such as the heavily indebted poor countries. The word poor countries there is somewhere in the middle there. What they call HIPIC, an enhanced HIPIC. Fast forward, and now the discussion is a number of those countries that were HIPIC and they benefited out of the HIPIC initiative are actually going back into having debt challenges. So that tells you, therefore, that for us to fully take advantage of the Africa Rising narrative and the potential that it gives, we really have to put the policy and other supportive investments in order. And I think there's every reason to be optimistic about that, because I think we've seen a number of countries proactively pursuing what you can call good policy. Because good policy simply means that you're going to attract investors, and you're going to see your economy transform. And that is really where I see the Africa Rising narrative being hinged upon. So it's what economists call a constraint optimization. You have a chance to do well, but that has to come with a number of things being put in place, not least a predictable policy environment, investing in requisite infrastructure that will support productivity, and also investing in people. Because people talk about African demographies. If you don't invest in people, the numbers alone don't mean much unless those numbers are characterized by jobs, characterized by skill, and skill that is going to transform the continent. So those are some of the requisite investments that can lead to the realization of the Africa Rising narrative. Otherwise, without that, it may end up simply being a cliche, as you put it. So optimism, but with a handful of caution.
Thank you so much, Jared. I think just to wrap it up, what Jared is really saying, that African Rising narrative is an opportunity, and Africa has a lot of work to do to actually realize that potential. Thank you for watching. My name is Pius Mushiri Mugo, the Managing Director of Lambo Capital, and you're watching Invest in Africa.